We now move on to our next speaker, who will be with us just in one moment, who is Sarah Grant, who is the Curator of Prints at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, Sarah has published widely on prints of the 18th century, and we're actually really lucky that she's with us today because she's immensely tired, having submitted her PhD thesis yesterday. So it's a terrific thing that she's here to share her research with us today, and it is new research. And her topic today is actually looking at the court around Marie-Antoinette. So she's looking at the senior French courtier, the Princesse de Lamballe, who was the close and long-standing confidante to Marie-Antoinette. And this new research is presented on the sympathetic elite community that sprang up between the travelling members of the English ton and key members of the French court during the late 18th century. The French Queen's own Anglophile inclinations and perceptible correlations in the portraits, both the groups and commissioned. So I'm really excited to hear this topic today and to hear what Sarah's going to share with us about it.
The reign of Marie-Antoinette and Queen Charlotte witnessed a social and cultural and artistic rapprochement between France and Britain that was entirely without precedent. And during the 1780s and the 1770s, the French began to cross the Channel in greater numbers than ever before. Of course, the English had always travelled south, and to get to the continent, they had to go through France. But this was quite exceptional for the French to suddenly start visiting London and the counties in these numbers. And one such person was the Italian-born Princesse de Lamballe, and she's largely forgotten today. She's really only remembered for the way that she died, which was being decapitated and torn limb from limb by the Paris mob during the revolutionary September massacres. Her head was placed on a pike and paraded in front of the Tuileries Palace, where Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI were imprisoned. But she, in life, served as superintendent of Marie-Antoinette's household, and that was the highest position that a female courtier could aspire to obtain. She was also an influential patron and cultural figure at the French court, and she had a very important collection, and she was also a bibliophile, she was a musical patron, she was all sorts of different things. Just 5 years before her tragic demise, the princess made a 3-month visit to England, and she also returned a second time in 1791, but as a fugitive. But this paper is going to focus on that first visit in 1787, which was effectively a grand tour in reverse. It was conducted when French Anglomania was at its height, and the portraits, official and unofficial, produced of her I'll touch on in this paper. But I'm also going to discuss her fellow Anglophile, who was partner in all of these Anglophile interests, and that was her mistress, Marie-Antoinette, and talk a little bit about Marie-Antoinette's collection of English prints, which were many of them portraits, and a sympathetic elite community that can be seen to have sprung up between the Queen and her courtiers and travelling members of the English ton during the last 2 decades of the 18th century, and discussing some of the resulting perceptible correlations in the portraits that both groups commissioned. So I'm showing you here 2 official portraits of the Princesse de Lamballe, the one on the left by Vigée-Lebrun and the one on the right by Joseph Ducreux, which showed her after she'd been appointed a superintendent and after she'd really started to sort of grow in profile and status at the French court and develop an international reputation across Europe, but also in the States as well, and in England, of course. So even before her visit in 1787, she was already an established Anglophile. She grew up in Turin as a princess of a cadet branch of the House of Savoy, Savoia-Carignano princess. And the House of Savoy was noted, and the court in Turin as well, for its hunting prowess. And her father had all his hounds shipped over from England. There's a bill that survives that documents this. So I'm just showing you here a slide of Stupinigi, which is the beautiful hunting palace just on the outskirts of Turin, which is where she spent her summers. So she was already familiar with all things English at that stage. But she also had in France an extensive English garden, landscaped in the grounds of one of her father-in-law's 34 chateaux. He was the second richest man in France after the king. Rambouillet, and this is the print that was published down the bottom, the right, of her English garden. And it actually features a hidden portrait of the princess as well, here on the seesaw. That's her. And she was also shown, she's miraculously seesawing herself here, there's no counterweight. This is the little cottage that she had in the garden. This is one of only 2 structures that remains in the garden today, and you can see the man-made sort of stream, river, that was placed, but you can see some of the other parts. This is the Hermitage as well, which is also still there, has just been conserved. But the fact that her English garden was published in this very famous series of prints by Le Rouge, who was a surveyor, shows that it was considered a paradigm of an English garden in Paris. And she was one of only a couple of people who are actually shown in the prints of their own garden. So she's shown as mistress of her domain in this particular print. She also had 2 other English gardens created in the grounds of her country house outside Paris, for which she enlisted the talents of Thomas Blakey. But when she arrived on these shores, and that's her, that's a little close-up of her seesawing away, her little dog observing her down the corner, and then that's her on the swing as well, at Rambouillet. But when she arrived on these shores in July 1787, the Princesse de Lamballe, with the exception of her brother-in-law, the Duc d'Orléans, was the highest-ranking French courtier of Louis XVI's court who had ever visited England. So as one of Marie-Antoinette's closest friends, and arguably her personal emissary and agent, her arrival could be, and very likely was, interpreted as the closest approximation to a state visit from the Queen of France herself. She survived the Channel crossing from Calais, which was a notoriously unpredictable, occasionally treacherous journey of 10 to 12 hours, and she landed at Dover in great style, flanked by a 40-strong retinue of ladies-in-waitings and attendants. From here, she went on by coach, arriving in London on the 10th of July, where she took up residence in the very heart of the city at Grenier's Hotel on Jermyn Street. Her arrival caused a sensation. It sent the English press into a frenzy and all the tumult chatter, and people who weren't invited to various events that were held for her were very upset, and that included Horace Walpole. Every activity she engaged in was closely scrutinised, and her progress from city to city across the country was followed by the journals of the time. A series of splendid entertainments was staged for her. There was a grand rout held by Sir Peter Burrell, who was the Lord Chamberlain and Member of Parliament, at his house in Whitehall. And then there was an outing to the Royal Academy at Woolwich to view the Royal Artillery, which was a spectacle clearly devised by the English hosts to signal to their French guests the superiority of the British Navy. Here, the princess was accompanied by the Duke of Richmond, the Duchess of Devonshire, Lady Duncannon, and other ladies of distinction. She supped with George III and Queen Charlotte at Kew, and she attended a sumptuous dinner given in her honour by the Duke of Queensberry. She then departed London on a tour of the country, which sounds rather like, if anybody's done it, the Attingham Country House course. She visited Tunbridge Wells, Brighton, Bath, and Oxford, and all the time viewing country houses and collections along the way, including Blenheim Palace and Broadlands, Lord Palmerston's seat, near Romsey, where Capability Brown had refaced the house in the Palladian style. The princess also viewed Lord Spencer's collection, either at Altrip or Spencer House in London. These visits to country houses, I think, are very significant, for these were arguably the nation's finest treasure houses, at once a backdrop to and purveyor of English identity. And through her tours, the princess would have both expressed and consolidated her interest in English art, but she would also have encountered, most importantly, a wealth of English portraits, the focal point of any country house, where a hall, gallery, or some other form of reception room is given over to the sequential display of dynastic power and continuity. Finally, having seen everything she could, that was sort of the highlight of the whole country, she left on the 11th of October after 3 months' sojourn, an exhaustive Anglo-Grand tour, and embarked on the journey home. But towards the very beginning of her stay, she sat for Richard Cosway, in a portrait that was rumoured at the time to be a gift intended for her friend, the Prince of Wales. Richard Cosway and his wife, Maria, were then the most fashionable portrait painters in London. Not only was Cosway official painter to the Prince of Wales, but he was also a noted favourite of the influential Duchess of Devonshire, his first important patron, and the couple cultivated a French clientele. Cosway captured the likeness of a number of French sitters from the Queen's circle, Queen Marie-Antoinette's circle, including Lamballe's brother-in-law, the Duc d'Orléans, and 2 of the Queen's closest friends, the Princesse de Tarente and the Duchesse de Polignac. And here comes the disclaimer, I'm afraid, because the portrait of Lamballe is now lost. Regrettably, it showed up briefly in a sale at Christie's in the 1950s, but for some reason they didn't take a photograph, so it was regrettably unillustrated. but the princess was described as being shown nearly full face, her head inclined to her left shoulder. So it's two miniatures and drawings of an equivalent date by Cosway of French sitters, including the Duchesse de Polignac here, who was Lamballe's greatest rival at court. They absolutely loathed each other. And then this is her, the Duchess's sister-in-law, the Comtesse de Polignac. And then this is Cosway's beautiful, beautiful miniature of Madame du Barry, who was Louis XV's last mistress and who was guillotined in the Revolution. And then another portrait, just this time of the Duchess of Devonshire, just to give an indication of the sort of portrait that she might have had when she sat for Cosway. It's probably most likely that it was a pencil drawing, because these were, well, actually a pencil or miniature, because they were both portable, but seemingly French sitters often had drawings like this. By the 1780s, the French had come to see the genres of portraiture and landscape as quintessentially English, and the motivations driving these commissions by French visitors, including the Princesse de Lamballe, were probably to procure a souvenir commemorating their visit, one being painted by a native artist that would contain an element of novelty to amuse the French court with on their return, second, to be seen demonstrating their connoisseurship and general largesse by extending their patronage to an artist judged of fashionable standing, and third, to create for the benefit of their new circle, their new English circle, and expressed in that country's visual idiom, a representation that would all the better assume currency and weight for its stylistic resemblance to its own. All members of the Princesse Lamballe's English circle had had their portraits done by Cosway several times over, and so the Princesse Lamballe's commission enabled her to make a gift of her own image to a prince renowned in England for his artistic patronage by an artist with whom he had a strong association. An unofficial portrait was created of the princess during her visit in the form of a Wedgwood jasperware cameo. This was for the merchant's series of heads of illustrious or famous personages, which incidentally we know from a surviving inventory that the princess collected herself. Wedgwood was very impatient for the mould to be completed, as he hoped to capitalise on the extraordinary interest of the princess fueled by her presence in the country. He also advertised the cameo in his French language edition of his famous catalogue, marketing it to a French audience as well as an English one. And the cameo was so popular, and here it is here, which says Princesse de Lamballe on the legend. It was so popular that a second, larger variation in black basalt was created. But these are, sadly today, considerably rarer than the jasperware ones. So again, I'm showing you, this is Marie-Antoinette's Wedgwood cameo that Wedgwood produced, and then this is the black basalt version. So it would have been a black basalt version like this of Lamballe. And they were usually after medals. In this case, it was, the Queen's one was after a medal, so the Lamballe's would also have been as well. From the same inventory I mentioned, we learn of the princess's enthusiasm for English prints. She had displays of these in 2 of her houses. In one suite of rooms of the 40 prints that were framed and displayed, 26 were English. So from this description, it's clear that these were stiffle prints. From the descriptions in the inventory, it's clear. Many after Angelica Kaufmann, and works by other famous practitioners like Bartolozzi, and a number of portraits. English prints became very popular in Paris during the late 1770s and throughout the 1780s, and one of the most popular categories was the portrait print. This was an interest that the princess shared with Marie-Antoinette. And this is her house in Passy, which was then a small country village, but is now obviously a suburb of Paris. And it was a country house, so that was part of the reason that she showed English prints in her country house, because that was appropriate to the setting. So a surviving set of bills reveals the extent of Marie-Antoinette's acquisitions of English prints and English portrait prints in particular. They detail orders of prints and books for her rooms at Versailles, covering the period 1784 to 1788, and so were therefore just a portion of the acquisitions she made while in residence, but they total thousands of livres across this 4-year period, a time frame that neatly coincides with the Princesse de Lamballe's visit to England in 1787. So from this, we have to conclude that the courtier's visit and subsequent reports of her journey in England helped to strengthen Marie-Antoinette's already active Anglomania. Recurring themes among the Queen's prints are maternal and romantic love and scenes of rural pleasures and domestic bliss. So, for instance, in 1784, she acquired honest, fresh-faced country characters like Patty, this one on the left, and the country maid after Bunbury. and some of the more domestic ones after Philip Mercier's Domestic Employment, and then Affection and Innocence as well, one of Bartolozzi's prints. Many of her purchases, Marie-Antoinette's, were made the same year, or within a few months even, of the print being published in London, and they reveal her desire to know and understand English sociability and indicate a running familiarity with current events and topical figures across the Channel. So, for instance, she was very interested clearly in famous contemporary English figures, and feats of female heroism and fortitude evidently appealed to her. So she had this print of Lady Harriet Ackland, who was famous for crossing enemy lines in the midst of the American Revolutionary Wars to locate her gravely wounded husband and minister to him. And she also was not above a few jokes. Marie-Antoinette had a sense of humour. She acquired an impression of Samuel Fore's satirical print of the Prince of Wales, the Royal Academy, in which he's shown boxing the soldier George Hanger, and she also acquired a caricature of the Prince's secret wedding to Mrs. Fitzherbert. Of greater import for this study, however, were the Queen's purchases of portrait prints. These included portrait prints of sitters she knew of, like George III with his family and a full-length portrait of the Prince of Wales, but she also had prints of individuals outside her circle of acquaintance, which she would have acquired as examples of the work of fashionable English artists, or were critically appraised as paradigms of the British school. And one such example is a print described as a portrait of Colonel Tarleton, which must be Reynolds's famously dashing evocation of the young soldier who commanded British troops in the American War of Independence. Tarleton would, of course, have been a figure of great curiosity to Marie-Antoinette, but the portrait had also been very well received by critics, and she would no doubt have been eager to see a work by an artist whose work was followed with such interest in France. She also had a portrait of the family of the Duke of Marlborough, possibly a print after Reynolds's monumental 1777 portrait of the family painted at Blenheim, or perhaps Bartolozzi's affecting depiction of the fourth Duke with his wife, Lady Caroline, and his third-born son, Francis. It's not quite clear from the inventory description which one it might have been. Another portrait in her collection was of the Duchess of Richmond. So she had this portrait of her in Turkish dress, and she also acquired a large number of portraits by John Sherwin and other artists of famous actresses and players, so Sarah Siddons, Elizabeth Hartley, Elizabeth Sheridan, Frances Abington, and Mary Robinson. And she bought 2 portrait prints of the Duchess of Devonshire in April 1784, one by Bartolozzi and a second entitled The Children of the Duchess of Devonshire. The former work might be one by the noble amateur Diana Beauclerc, showing the Duchess in profile, but more likely, given the time frame, it was probably Bartolozzi's print here after James Nixon. And the other one is harder to track down because at the time, Georgiana only had one child, but the print is described as a print of her children. So was it perhaps a mistake on the part of the clerk? Was it referring to an earlier print showing Georgiana's mother with her child? It's not entirely clear, but anyway, it was a Duchess of Devonshire. At the time, there existed a brisk trade in French and English portrait prints in both capitals, and in London, collectors were offered English prints after French portraits of French sitters. So there were a huge number of English prints after French portraits of Marie-Antoinette and the other women of her circle as well, in particular the Comtesse d'Artois and the Comtesse de Provence, who were in fact Lamballe's cousins once removed. And I could have shown you a really huge number of examples here, but I've just honed it down to 2. With this concrete evidence of Marie-Antoinette's purchases of English portrait prints and the highly active commercial trade of portrait prints in mind, it becomes clear that the Queen and Lamballe had a ready familiarity with and interest in English portraiture that complemented their more general Anglophile persuasions. The same can be asserted with regard to French portraits, for their well-travelled English friends and Francophiles, the Duchess of Devonshire and Lady Elizabeth Foster. And together with the Duchesse de Polignac, this was a small fellowship of women, and poses an ideal subject for examining links between the 2 schools of female portraiture in France and England at this time, because really this was an unprecedented sorority united by many shared interests and experiences, creating a unique forum for cultural and artistic exchange. Scholars have understandably shied away from the problematic task of effecting comparisons between French and British portraits, particularly in light of their substantially different apparatus and the instruments of artistic instruction and patronage. nor do art historians generally examine different schools for sweeping parallels, considering this practice fraught with possible pitfalls, and you'll have to tell me what you think. But a general influence of the French school on English portrait painters and vice versa has continued to be discerned by successive art historians over the past 3 decades. And so given the abundant overlap between the elite societies of this time, in particular the circles of Lamballe and Devonshire, the Duchess of Devonshire, it seems logical to conclude that something may be learned from comparing the cross-channel portraits they commissioned. Even a cursory comparison of this now iconic portrait of Marie-Antoinette with a rose by Vigée-Lebrun and an equally famous portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire by Gainsborough reveals a striking resemblance in pose and format, if not the brushwork and handling. The ethereal dresses and hats, the positioning of their hands, and the pink rose held by both sitters, the benevolently regal gaze, even the rakish tilt to their plumed hats are all remarkable similarities. The Queen's portrait was painted in 1783 and was exhibited in the Paris Salon that year, a hastily executed substitute for a virtually identical portrait, en chemise or en gaule, which the artist was forced to withdraw following a public outcry at its perceived impropriety. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with the story of the muslin dress that people felt was not appropriate attire for a queen. Despite this initial reaction, the much maligned muslin dress portrait of Marie-Antoinette became something of a succès de scandale, and the essential elements of this portrait and its replacement went on to be widely copied in the portraiture of the time. The Gainsborough portrait was executed 4 years later in 1787, but unfortunately it's not documented in the Chatsworth archives. In fact, none of the Duchess's portrait commissions are. And not only has its history been obfuscated by its long disappearance from that collection and subsequent theft, it was only returned to Chatsworth in 1994, but attention has not unnaturally concentrated on this sensational second life and not on illuminating the circumstances of its execution. It's not only possible, but entirely likely, that Lady Elizabeth Foster saw one or all versions of Vigée-Lebrun's portrait of the Queen during her 1785 visit to Versailles, and she and Georgiana cannot have failed to be aware of the fracas that surrounded the portrait's first presentation to the public. It may even have appealed to the Duchess's playful sense of humour to base her own portrait along similar lines, and considering the proliferation of Vigée-Lebrun portraits at this time and that artist's considerable fame, the Duchess may have sought to realise aspects of the sophisticated template, modelled beguilingly by Marie-Antoinette, but judiciously through the moderating lens of a peculiarly English sensibility. The Princesse de Lamballe, the Duchess de Polignac, the Duchess of Devonshire, and Lady Elizabeth, I should come up with some kind of acronym for them all, were all devotees of the double friendship portrait, a format pioneered by French artists. A double portrait of the Duchess, Lady Elizabeth Foster, here, which is in the Wallace collection, was executed by the French miniaturist Guérin on one of their 2 visits together to Paris in 1790 and 1791, and bears a marked resemblance to a portrait of the Duchesse de Polignac with her sister-in-law, again, on the left. On the 11th of August, Georgiana had written to her mother, Lady Spencer, saying, "My hair is doing by Béziers and my picture drawing by Guérin." The work is typical of Guérin's acknowledged specialty, which was portraits of female sitters in profile, single or in groups before a black background, modelled after the isolated figures in dark grounds seen in Roman or Pompeian wall paintings, and 2 copies were made of it, one for each sitter. Whereas Auguste Prin's portrait of the Duchesse and the Comtesse de Polignac, drawn the very same year, is strikingly similar and served a similarly emotive purpose. The Princesse de Lamballe, for her part, also chose to be portrayed this way, with the Comtesse de Laval by Louis-Auguste Prin. And Isabelle, who was another artist patronized by Lamballe, who also specialized in this form of double portrait, actually credited English mezzotints with the influence for his velvety drawing style. So that's another interesting connection. So some of these similarities, of course, can be ascribed to common fashions. In England, French dress had long been considered superior to domestic products, with the exception of Spitalfield silks. And increasingly in France, Anglomania had brought with it an appreciation for the simplicity of English, specifically country, fashions. Marie-Antoinette had made a gift of her favorite muslin dresses to Georgiana and is generally accepted as having introduced French style and fashion to corresponding English circles, while English gloves and plumed hats, as modelled by the Duchesses of Devonshire and Marlborough, appeared in French fashion plates and were taken up by the Queen and her courtiers. But this too is a strong indication of converging cultural perspectives, and the gifts that they exchange document this desire to actively promote and subsume in return their own and each other's customs. So I show you this portrait here by Reynolds of Lady Elizabeth Foster and Bernet's portrait of Lamballe, where it is possible that it's the hair and the dress, and that's what makes them seem so similar. But I think that's part of the question, really. The reigning cult of sensibility is also a factor in these similar representations. But it seems, and I show you here two portraits, well, the Vigée Lebrun one again, and this miniature of Lamballe that are very much in that kind of the vogue of sensibility. But it seems that these are instances where sitters may have styled themselves along similar lines, and there are doubtless more examples to be discovered. This could suggest a greater conflation of ideologies, or at the very least shared principles, than has previously been ascribed to these two schools. More scholarship on this is necessary, and on French émigré portrait painters in England, both itinerant artists seeking new sources of patronage, and the wave of artists who sought temporary sanctuary in London during and immediately following the Revolution, like Danlou, here, whom again the Princesse de Lamballe also sat for. What is clear, however, is the vital part played in all of this by the print market in bridging these two cultures, and that these stylistic similarities can be interpreted as part of the general evolution in late 18th century portraiture towards a more fluid and arguably universal visual idiom, one that dissolved national borders.